Let's drive.
It is a dark and rainy day, which means it is fitting to talk about Wuthering Heights, especially since chapter 2 opens with yesterday afternoon set in misty and cold. I want to talk about Mr. Lockwood and how we can assume he's probably from London society. Even though it's not outright told to us, we can assume based on his actions, his thoughts, and the little details he gives us, such as here where he says that I'm coming up from dinner. I dine between 12 and 1 o'clock. The housekeeper, matronly lady taken as a fixture along with the house, could not or would not comprehend my request that I might be served at 5. Now, in the country, they eat at more regular hours, or at least hours we are accustomed to, whereas London society eats later because they're out later at parties and balls and they wake up later, so their schedules push back. And you see this often commented in historical fictions. But also with the society thing, we're seeing that Lockwood is very accustomed to society and not being solitary. And even him saying that, it was misty and cold, I had half a mind to spend it by my study fire instead of wading through the heath and mud of Wuthering Heights. He was going to go to Wuthering Heights, even though at the end of chapter 1 he was eager to leave Heathcliff's company, but there's no one. So that should tell us as a reader that this is such a secluded, solitary area of the country, community, and that to have someone like Lockwood who's so accustomed to society with a lot of people, this is like being on an alien planet. This is completely different cultures, completely different, you know, way of interacting in society and how little it is, which then opens up to us wondering again if he is a biased narrator, not unreliable, but biased. Because one might wonder if he is retelling us a story through a more gothic lens to fit the setting, to fit this otherworldliness, to fit this kind of feeling that he has being so secluded and left into this world and hearing this tale that would make sense to him. So we have to wonder how much of this is potentially true, how much of this is amped up to fit into the feelings and the emotions and the prejudices he might have towards this country coming from somewhere so different. Like, there are certain things that we should probably keep in the back of our mind as we were reading. We are getting our first glimpse of this being a romanticism era of writing. Now, romanticism is not romantic in the sense of, like, relationships. Romanticism is an era of thinking, philosophy, writing that encourage and idolize nature and emotions and these kind of things. It was done in response to the Enlightenment thinking, where they had reason and the scientific revolution and they applied it to every area like philosophy and law and things like that. They thought that they could discover and control everything. Frankenstein came out of that. Like, Frankenstein came out of the romanticism too, but it was in response to the Enlightenment thinking. And this is the same here. And you can see it with, Mr. Lockwood running out into pretty much a snowstorm. He is not giving nature its due respect. He thinks that he can control it. He thinks that he can be above it. That, this wild nature that he is setting forth into with a snowstorm, it won't hinder his goal of reaching the Society of Wuthering Heights. It won't hinder him of reaching home because he thinks that he has control over it. So we're going to see this theme pop up time and time again throughout the book of like man versus nature. Mr. Lockwood is so determined into coming to Wuthering Heights, despite it being like having black frost and the air made him shiver. The fence, he had to hop the fence and run up, and the dogs barked. And he said, "Wretched inmates, you deserve perpetual isolation for your species, for your churlish inhospitality. Hospitality. At least I would not keep my doors barred in the daytime. I don't care. I will get in." And there's a couple ways we can unpack this. One, is he talking to the dogs when he makes this speech or talking to Heathcliff? Because you could argue it's both. But also, who's the one being selfish? Is it Heathcliff barring someone from coming in, making the house look so inhospitable? Or is it Lockwood forcing himself upon someone that is making it very apparent that he does not want this society? And it's a very interesting tale, I think, that's being shown here of like, I think you could look at it in one angle of like Lockwood comes from an upper class, someone that could just walk through any door and get what he wants. And yet he's coming upon this nature, this corner of the world that is inhospitable and he cannot command to his will. And it's again man versus nature in the sense, but taken into a man-made form that like you can't go into the forest and be like, this is mine. It's nature, which goes into the romanticism era of thinking. You see it pop up time and time again. An example would be William Wordsworth's poem Lucy Gray, talking about the nature there. And like it's again, like I said, man versus nature, but also like there are small corners of the world that don't want you to come in and share their tale sometimes, or have an outsider share their tale. Like I think Emily Bronte is kind of showing like she's part of the Moor, so she kind of understands it, so she can share this tale. But if someone else, if Lockwood had come in and shared it, would he share it differently? So we have to wonder. Like I think Nell is Emily Bronte, like that is her telling the tale, and Nell is technically telling the tale to Lockwood. But we also have to wonder, is Lockwood acting as sort of like Emily Bronte's editor and tweaking it in a sense? I don't know. Like there's so many things that you could kind of like poke at and theorize. I don't know exactly, but just like a small paragraph like this, you can just pick at for hours and days because this is just so subtle and layered. And yeah, I also like this kind of like paralleling, I guess you can say, being done here where like Heathcliff has his door locked and barred, inhospitable, doesn't want people welcoming. He is technically the master of the house. But now we're meeting Hareton, who should be the master of the house, but is treated as a servant. And yet he is the one that welcomes Mr. Lockwood into the house, bringing him into a nice, warm apartment kind of room, bringing him to the fire in a very kind of in the way that you would expect someone to do to a wandering traveler or a guest. So again, even though Harrington is being treated as a servant and has fallen technically in the world without his fault, it was taking on his father's burden, father's sins. He acts more like the master of the house than the master of the house who's pretending to be the master of the house. Mr. Lockwood gets his first glimpse of the missus, and this is Catherine. I'm differentiating them of Kathy is the one that Heathcliff grew up with and loved. Catherine is Caffrey's daughter. That is how I'm going to differentiate them because they have the same name, which is really annoying. Um, and he says that he bowed and waited, thinking she would bid me to take a seat. She looked at me, leaning back in her chair, and remained motionless and mute. First off, we have to remember that Catherine is still relatively young, still relatively a teenager. And think of when you're, as a teenager, were annoyed with your parent. And it might be irrational, but if they had guests over, you might be a little inhospitable towards their guests because you were annoyed with your parents and they were an extension of them. It's a little bit of this, but also Lockwood is assuming, based off social etiquette, that she is in charge of this house and could make commands, but she has been so broken down, and Heathcliff runs this with an iron fist that no, and she's not gonna. She's been so broken down that it's like not even worth it. Like why offer this hospitality? If she had done it in the past, he probably would have squandered her attempts probably in the past. But also, poor Catherine, we have to think of this in the future because she didn't start off this way. She didn't start off this cold and isolated. She grew into this. She was shaped into this by the harsh winds of Heathcliff and the environment he put him in. And of course, Catherine would be hostile towards any newcomers, especially a fancy dressed, nice newcomer, because the last time this happened, she ended up in this current situation she is now, alone, isolated, imprisoned, her family dead. And yeah, like of course she'd be like this. So it's fascinating seeing these uglier versions upon first impression of Lockwood and then learning their tale later and understanding them later. But I like this first impressions that we get of each of these characters because from an outsider they would seem cruel and harsh, but it's upon getting to know them better that you understand why they became the way that they became. They weren't born this way, they were shaped this way. I really enjoy this interaction between Catherine and Mr. Lockwood because it is him expecting her to abide by societal expectations. He's expecting her to be pretty and kind and welcoming and amiable, like a nice host. That's what he expects as the female figure of this household, to be that. And she's not. She's staring at him to a point where it's making him feel awkward. he asks if she would keep one in the litter, and she says they're not mine, to a point that is more hostile than even Heathcliff. And he goes, oh, then maybe one of these. And she says that's a strange choice of favorites. And he realizes it's not a pile of kittens, it's a pile of dead rabbits. And this whole thing is leading into, like I said, him expecting her to be kind and sweet and welcoming and, to want these lovable, cuddly animals, but that's not her. And it's fascinating because, like, one is his Southern expectations of women, and that would not be able to, I feel like, truly exist in this world. And we see it with Isabella later, that those kind of people that exist in the moors often get broken or sickly, and they struggle not only because of the nature that surrounds them, but the nature of the humans that surround them here, that you kind of need to be a little bit tougher to survive this particular environment and society. And Catherine used to be a little bit more in the vein of what Lockwood expects, but in her short lifetime, she was broken down and now she's hardened. And I kind of like that Emily Bronte's having this female who's not even trying to put on a mask anymore, not even trying to pretend. She's like, this is what I need to be like to survive in this particular home and environment. Also, knowing the end, knowing Catherine's journey, it's fascinating her just staring at him and seeing the parallels of someone coming from the same home with joy and hopefulness and kindness, wandering to this home willingly, only to be hurt. And Catherine, I think, by being hostile, is trying to deter him from coming to this place, and even says to him, you should not have come out. Now, you obviously can interpret it on the surface of like the weather, because the weather is about to be terrible. You should not have come out in that weather, but you should not have come here too. You should not have come out of that home, because I think Catherine knows, like I said, the potential outcome of him being here is only going to suck him in like quicksand. It's a hostile home. It's not going to bring him joy. Avoid the society. It's almost like a human that's been trapped in fairy and sees another human there, and she's so jaded, at the same time trying to deter the other person from being trapped too. Previously, I mentioned how the age part of the casting is what annoys me the most. Also, the race, obviously, but the age is very important because movies are a visual media. Being able to see a character's age, like, subconsciously adds more weight to a situation. It'd be like having a 30 or 40-year-old playing Romeo and Juliet all of a sudden becomes less tragic and more eye rolling. You're like, God, just get over it. Like, why are you acting so immature? And it's the same here. It's seeing them young explains a lot of their actions, but also adds more tragedy. For example, here in my copy on page 16, Lockwood describes Catherine as slender and apparently scarcely out of past girlhood, so probably barely 18, maybe 19, 20. An admirable form and the most exquisite little face I'd ever had the pleasure of beholding. Small features, very fair, flaxen ringlets, or rather golden, and hanging loose on her delicate neck, and eyes, had they been agreeable in expression, that would have been irresistible. Her beauty, her smallness, her youth adds to the tragedy. And this is what I think also lures Lockwood into wanting to know the story and wanting to know more. But also, like, she's so young. She should be looking at the world so bright eyed, bushy tailed, and full of hope. But yet she is weighted down. She would have been beautiful to him, irresistible, even if her eyes expressed in any other manner, but they have been hardened. And seeing someone so young in a movie look like that adds more tragedy than if you see someone older, because if someone's older, you're like, well, yeah, of course. Life hits you hard. You become hardened and jaded and a little worn as life wears on. But seeing someone so young look like that, then you feel tragic, you feel sad, and you go, what has happened to you to cause you to look like that? And so that's why age is so important to me when it comes to movies and TV shows and visual media, is because they add more weight to the stories. We have to remember, even though we don't know this quite yet because it's still early days, so there's little signs that we're seeing already that we will learn later the actual truth of, is that this is an abusive household and Heathcliff is the abuser. He runs his home with an iron fist. Everyone cowers under him. And even those with strong will, like Catherine, is in fear. And like the young man that stares at Lockwood as if they're in a feud, it's because he is worried for Catherine. He cares for Catherine. And this is Harrington, as we were later to learn. And while he does act against probably Heathcliff's expectations of like bringing the guy in and will probably get punished, because I think some part of him is kind in that way and welcoming someone into the home and giving them warmth out of the cold, he at the same time doesn't want this man to cause any more problems for Catherine than Catherine already causes for herself. Like, he's very protective of her. It's like watching two children fight back, but also be equally protective of one another against their abusive parental figure. That is what's happening in this household. So while Heathcliff is tragic and life has twisted him, we also cannot forgive him for turning around and pushing this onto others, continuing this act of violence and abuse. He had the choice of making a difference. Instead, he is punishing not the people that had harmed him in the first place, but their next of kin, the next generation, putting them into a very abusive household. I love this description that Lockwood gives of what would be Hareton. He says that I began to doubt whether he was a servant or not. His dress and speech were both rude, entirely devoid of superiority observed in Mr. and Mrs. Heathcliff. His thick brown curls were rough and uncultivated, his whiskers encroached bearishly over his cheeks, and his hands were embrowned like those of a common laborer. Still, his bearing was free, almost haughty, and he showed none of the domestic acidity in attending to the lady of the house. In the absence of clear proof of his condition, I deemed it best to abstain from noticing his curious conduct. And the reason why this is fascinating to me is that it mirrors the beginning of not the story, not the beginning of the story, but the beginning of Heathcliff and Caffrey's story. Heathcliff looked very similar. He seemed like a servant, but wasn't a servant, had a haughtiness of him that, pointed to maybe he's not, because he doesn't quite act like the rest of the servants, but he obviously doesn't look like Catherine and the rest of the family. There's a lack of haughtiness that would come naturally from someone like Catherine, as we see with the action. But the difference is that Heathcliff, because of his race, because of his obvious color difference, will continuously be doubted and tried. He will continuously face roadblocks. Whereas Hareton, at the end of this book, gets the chance to rise back to his rightful place. And again, Hareton was supposed to inherit this home. This is his family home. He was supposed to inherit it, but Heathcliff usurped him, and like a cuckoo bird. And I think that's just so interesting to see that both Heathcliff and Hareton technically faced a very similar, childhood, if it makes sense. Being used, abused, dressed, looked similar enough, except their race is a little bit more obvious. And yet, in the end, Hareton gets his rightful place and Heathcliff has his downfall. You have Heathcliff's race, you have Hareton's heritage. So you wonder if the argument is that you should not have usurpers taking titles, that only those who inherit titles will inherit the proper good nature to inherit that. Is that the argument that we're having? Or are we arguing that nature versus nurture, but at the same time, Hareton breaks away from that? He doesn't continue the cycle of abuse. So what is the argument we can have with this book? What is the argument Bronte could be possibly asking the reader? It is in my belief that Wuthering Heights can fit within the Romanticism era of writing. Now, Romanticism does not mean sexual romantic like relationships. Romanticism era of thinking believes in the emotions and that the world is greater and you cannot control it, going against the Enlightenment era thinking where they believed in like the scientific revolution and that man can find and know everything eventually and that they can control it. And Romanticism goes against that. And often they use nature to illustrate this. And I'm bringing that up because, like, for example, here, Heathcliff is pointing out Lockwood's folly of coming out in the midst of a snowstorm. And I fear, and he says, do you know that you run a risk of being lost in the marshes? People familiar with these moors often miss their road on such evenings, and I can tell you there's no chance of a change at present. And it's showing, like, even those familiar with the moors, like, cannot control the moors. They do not know the moors. Moors is greater. It is emphasizing how man cannot control nature. Man cannot control everything. Sometimes nature beats us. And it's the same with like also paralleling the relationship here. Lockwood cannot just come in with his southern etiquette and assume that he can kind of politely browbeat Heathcliff to be his way. Like Heathcliff is synonymous with nature, that he is wild and untamed, and despite the best actions, sometimes it's best to just respect it from a distance. So Heathcliff snaps at Catherine, and Lockwood says that he started at it. The tone in which the words were said revealed a genuine bad nature. I no longer felt inclined to call Heathcliff a capital fellow. And I like what it's kind of showing here, that like Heathcliff is very duplicitous, that he, depending on the situation and what he can get out of it, he shows a very different face. Lockwood literally saw his first interaction that he treated him hostilely and then eventually changed his tune a little bit. But even here, like you're seeing that it's all a facade, it's all an act, that that is his true nature, that he is angry and treats others ill. And that could be due to his nurturing, the way that he was brought up and the way he was treated when he was younger. But it goes into my thoughts immediately going to how so many people love this like romantic pairing right now in books where if like the guy is an asshole and mean to everyone, but the love interest is like, yeah, but he loves me. And it's like, why do we idolize that? And we shouldn't idolize Heathcliff either. That like, yes, his love for Catherine is there. This is slightly a romantic tale, but it's toxic. And not all pairings should exist, exist. Having a toxic one doesn't mean you're gonna end up well in the long run. It's not good for either person. And at the end of the day, Heathcliff's a terrible person despite his love for Catherine. That might show a nice side of him, and maybe he could have been different if he was treated differently, but he is still a terrible person, and we shouldn't be romanticizing him and forgiving him because he's choosing to act this way. No one's forcing his hand in any way, especially when he starts to gain agency and power. He continues to choose to act like this. And like we see it here, he has all the power in this household, in this situation, and then he decides to abuse and harm others within his household. What Mr. Lockwood says here is a great illustration of image and facade, because he realizes that he had blundered, that Catherine is not married to Heathcliff, and he goes, oh, maybe is the Heathcliff Jr., of course, thinking it's Hareton, it's not Heathcliff Jr., but he's making assumptions based off appearances and not having enough knowledge. And he says, here's the consequence of being buried alive. She has thrown herself away upon the board with sheer ignorance that better individuals existed. And it's like he's assuming like, oh, well, it's because they're in the country and there's not many picking, so obviously she picked this boorish man, not realizing that like this boorish looking man has a good heart, as we will later learn throughout the story. And we've seen already, snippets of it in this brief interaction we've had with Hareton. Like he has a good heart, but based off his appearance, you assume the worst, and he's assuming things based off their images. And that is part of, I think, the theme of this book is how things look, facades, images, appearances, first impressions. And it's also just like him filling in the blanks with his own pre-existing biases. And so like once again we have to question the entire truth of the story. We have to wonder if this is a biased narrator, not an unreliable, because they're not purposely trying to mislead us, but biased based off both Lockwood's impression of the world and his hearing and Nell's impression. So this story we have to take with a slight grain of salt. I think is more truthful than an unreliable narrator, but it is obviously biased. Once again, going in the whole thing with the facade and imagery and things, and also pride being a big thing of this. Hareton says, my name is Hareton Earnshaw, growled the other, and I'd counsel you to respect it. This whole time, Lockwood's been describing him as like a bore, as a clown, as uncouth, and yet Hareton should earn the respect because of his name. His name is on this house, but yet based off appearances, automatically Lockwood treats him lower and sees him as lower. And it's fascinating because like Hareton doesn't force like doesn't have airs about him, but that was also because of the situation he's currently in. But yet simultaneously he knows his family name and knows the respect that he is owed, but yet the circumstances does not count it. So like I think a part of the argument with Emily Bronte could be having is that like just because it's your name, do you really are you really owed the respect? If you have a house, are you really owed respect? Like your actions and the way you treat others should garner respect and honor and pride and things like that. So I think it's her questioning, family titles, family heritage, things like that, things that automatically get respect just because you were born in the right family kind of thing. I'm rambling a little bit, but I think there's something there. Another sign of this being a biased story is being done very obviously with like Lockwood continuously saying things such as like he feels like he's impeding on this pleasant family circle. Like nothing has shown itself being a pleasant family, but he continues to think it's his fault that he's blundering and causing this interaction amongst the group, not seeing that like this is their normal. They're this toxic. And it could be just because like he can't wrap his head around that like this is not his normal. He's never seen a family situation this toxic and this dysfunctional that like he's trying to justify maybe this is just a fluke and not the normal for them. And like it's fascinating the things that like the lengths that people would go to backbend to ignore abuse even when it's right before their eyes. I think that's part of the conversation Emily Bronte's having. As I previously talked about, nature is such a heavy aspect of the story, but it's not nature itself. Sometimes, for instance, this family here are kind of a physical representation of nature that Lockwood is bemoaning, like, how am I to get home? And he's getting irritated as they all ignore him, moving on with their way. And you can see this, like, it's very similar to nature that you can yell at the wind, but the wind's not going to stop doing what it's doing. And that's what's happening here, that Lockwood is a representation of man, that we cannot force others or nature to bend to our whims despite our kind of, what's the word? Pride, ego, like thinking that we can. And that's again a very big figure in the Romanticism era of philosophy. So yeah, I just love like seeing them interacting and continuing their everyday despite Lockwood's being there and him, becoming irritated. It just immediately I was like, oh, it's like nature. So one of the things about the Enlightenment was that they needed to know everything, that like even like the scientific revolution, the men that founded the scientific revolution, despite them being Christians, their findings rock the bedrock of the Catholic Church. And we're seeing it kind of being reflected here of like Lockwood being such an epitome of like the enlightened man from the South, that he knows that Catherine is mocking Joseph as she teases that she is a witch, that she has been studying the Black Book, that she would do worse. Why do you think that Cal died? Now, having no Catherine after reading this about 20 times, I do know that like she is mocking him, but we're seeing this kind of conversation being brought up of like the enlightened person who thinks that they know everything, and then the superstitious person who may not know everything, but like which is better is neither better. And this conversation that is being kind of presented very subtly with this, but also the North and South, and this whole kind of conversation that is being presented to us to maybe discuss and think over in this way of this interaction here.